Remember how Vysotsky said, "If I decide to do something, I'll definitely have a drink"? What's nice about Trump is that if he says something, it always means something and it will be done. Maybe not right now, maybe later, but it will be. I'm talking about how Trump often said, "Why are we, being far from Ukraine, paying more than Europeans, for whom Russia is their local regional problem?" And also remember, Europe gives Russia money, which Russia uses to destroy Ukraine and then gives Ukraine weapons and aid. But of course, 2 or 3 times less. So that Ukraine defends itself from weapons that were produced with European money. At the same time, it's clear that the United States makes the best weapons in the world. And as the Pakistan-India conflict showed, and by the way, Iran-Israel as well, it can outperform both Russian and Chinese weapons on the battlefield. How do we solve this equation? How do we stop the flow of money to Russia? And how do we provide excellent weapons to Ukraine without making American taxpayers pay for them? Trump is leading our country because he knows how to solve equations, even if no one else couldn't solve them, and everyone decided they were unsolvable. First, the active phases of the war. In 1922, the total volume of gas imports to Europe collapsed from 40% of what Europe consumed to, listen here, 5%. After Trump's presidency began, the transit of pipeline gas through Ukraine stopped completely, whereas it had been flowing prior to that. The European Commission is discussing with the United States the supply of American liquefied gas in order to completely abandon gas from Russia. Gas supplies from Azerbaijan have doubled and reached 12 billion cubic meters. Israel sends gas to Egypt, where it is liquefied, and now supplies approximately 10% of what Russia used to supply. The United Kingdom and Poland have completely stopped using Russian gas. It's clear they have the biggest issues with Putin. European Union members continue to purchase Russian oil, but only under previously signed long-term contracts. No new ones are being signed. China, India, and Turkey buy oil and gas from Russia. Well, there are 3 main buyers, and there are also some significantly smaller ones, along with Turkey and India. I apologize. The White House is negotiating to stop these purchases. The United States has long wanted to supply Azerbaijan, Israeli, and its own liquefied gas to Turkey and India. Due to India distancing itself from the Moscow-Beijing-Tehran axis, a new round of negotiations has begun. And Trump hopes to switch India completely to American weapons, driving Russia out of the market, and to supply them with American and Saudi oil instead of our and Saudi oil. By Saudi, I mean from everywhere, that is Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. So the issue of reducing Russia's income is being addressed, and it's being addressed quite successfully. And what about paying for weapons? And here, the solution turned out to be simple. Like all brilliant things, we, America, will supply Ukraine with weapons, but Europe will pay for those weapons. Well, the European Union and Britain, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And the restriction on the range of shells and missiles has already been lifted by Europe with Ukraine, and Kyiv can now carry out operations in the rear of Russian troops. This is all the result of Russia saying, yes, we'll negotiate, but at the same time it started to intensify its bombings. I think that Putin overdid it. Russia shouldn't have tried to fool Trump. This can go on up to a certain point when all the tricks run out, and Trump realizes that Putin was simply lying, pathetically, disgustingly, and most importantly, stupidly lying. Like, maybe something good will happen for us. Maybe the Americans will fall out with Ukraine. Maybe the spirit of resistance in Ukraine will disappear. It didn't disappear.
During the summer offensive, Putin firmly set his sights on Pokrovsk. This small city is a key strategic target for both Russia and Ukraine because of its important position on the Eastern Front. The war is in Ukraine. Right now, it is still under Ukrainian control, and Ukraine is using it as a logistics hub. This is helped by the fact that Pokrovsk is essentially located at a crossroads, which allows Ukraine to continue supplying its troops fighting Russian forces in Donetsk. Putin wants to cut off this supply line, but that's not the only reason he needs to capture Pokrovsk. As noted, the city is only 24 miles from the administrative border of Donetsk. Capture Pokrovsk, and you get a direct route to that border. And when the border falls, Putin will finally be able to claim full control over Donetsk. So the reason for the fight for Pokrovsk is quite obvious. Ukraine needs to hold the city both for logistical reasons and to prevent Putin from establishing control over Donetsk. And Putin needs it for the opposite reasons.
That is both psychologically and logistically. I'm not sure if there's such a word in Russian. Putin needs to capture Pokrovsk. So what is the great and mighty, the second army in the world doing for this?
The president of Russia ordered 110,000 soldiers to be concentrated in this region, who were sent there to reinforce the 8th Combined Arms Army, which Moscow had already assigned to capture Pokrovsk. These troops were meant to lead the Russian offensive, with Putin intending to use them in frontal assaults against Ukrainian defenses. The plan was simple, to send more and more people until Ukraine faltered and then broke. According to Sarak, the 110 soldiers who arrived were not going to enter Pokrovsk without armor and ammunition.
Artillery units,
armored vehicles and mechanized infantry, as well as a huge stockpile of weapons intended to deliver the final devastating blow to Pokrovsk. But before that could happen, the soldiers had to take up their positions. According to Karak, Russian soldiers infiltrated preparatory positions around Donetsk at the end of spring. They may have used the strange truce for Victory Day, which Putin announced back in May, as cover. When the bombs stopped falling for 3 days, the soldiers were able to take up their positions. These soldiers were under the command of Colonel Ruslan Goryachkin, the head of the 8th Combined Arms Army, whom Putin personally chose for both his organizational skills and his extreme brutality. Goryachkin ensured his large army took their positions. He also made sure that the upcoming offensive had enough supplies. Deep in a settlement called Kartsisk, there was an ammunition depot that was supposed to provide everything necessary for 110 soldiers. As Karak says, Colonel Goryachkin put all his eggs in one basket. There is an old saying that explains why this is such a mistake. In investment terms, putting all your eggs in one basket means investing all your money in one type of investment.
Putting everything in one fist. You increase your chances of success, but at the same time you increase the risk. And this increased risk either leads to champagne, ladies and gentlemen, or leads to a disastrous defeat.
On one side, there was a Russian commander who believed he had gathered everything necessary for his troops to organize a powerful offensive that would finally lead to the fall of Pokrovsk. On the other hand, Ukraine didn't have nearly as many troops as Goryachkin had. Instead, Ukraine targeted a vital supply line that was supporting the Russian soldiers. Both parties had plans, and Goryachkin acted first. On June 30th, 6 of these fighters took off from their runways and headed east toward Pokrovsk. 24 provided the main details in the July 1st report covering this attack. The report states that explosions shook Donetsk and one of the Ukrainian fighters destroyed a steel plant near Pokrovsk. It is reported that missiles provided by the United Kingdom were used in these strikes. These long-range missiles have become a powerful, though limited in number, weapon for Ukraine. After sunset on June 30, 2025, 6 Ukrainian strike fighters took off from their runways and headed east, he writes. As they approached occupied Donetsk, 2 aircraft released decoys from the DMSTA, 60 each. It's a flying bag of electronic warfare tricks designed to suppress and distract enemy air defenses. Breaking through the night, they headed northeast while the strike group was approaching from the southwest. These first 2 planes served as decoys. It was the other 4 out of 6 that delivered the devastating missile strike. It was a brilliant plan. According to Sarak, with a single strike, Ukraine was able not only to eliminate Putin's offensive leader in Pokrovsk, but also most of his staff, as well as several subordinate commanders. Ukraine didn't just cut off the head of the Russian operation. It cut off the head, arms, neck, and torso, leaving only the legs, which are running around chaotically in panic. The second blow in the devastating series of 2 was about to follow. While Russian soldiers were sorting through the burning remains of the former headquarters of the 8th Combined Arms Army, Ukraine was already identifying and preparing to strike the next target. This time, the Security Service of Ukraine would be involved in the operation. If the first strike relied on the destructive power of missiles supplied by the United Kingdom, the subsequent attack would be more targeted. Using drones, the Security Service of Ukraine intended to slip past the few remaining Russian air defense systems in Donetsk to destroy the ammunition depot in Kharkiv, which we mentioned earlier. Metsa provides the details. On the evening of July 2nd, Ukraine reportedly conducted a strike, with the first Security Service of Ukraine drones, 220, hitting their targets around 2,200. The initial strike nearly obliterated the ammunition depot, with subsequent waves following. Why? Well, as Mara writes, the facility was a favorable target in the sense that it was filled with exactly the types of explosives that Ukraine needed to destroy it. The precise drone strikes were focused on these explosive munitions, and as soon as the drones hit the target, secondary explosions began. The Russian munitions themselves ignited and started to spark, which triggered a chain reaction of explosions that ultimately led to the destruction of the facility in Kharkiv. When the pallets with munitions caught fire, they detonated other shells and bombs stored nearby. The explosions lit up the sky and shook the ground so much that they could be seen and felt from up to 20 kilometers away. It's 12.4 miles, Mara explains. On any other day, Putin would have been angry about losing the ammunition depot, but he would have known that his troops had others they could rely on. But remember what we said earlier. Eggs, basket. Goryachkin kept almost all the ammunition that Russia was planning to use in the offensive on Pokrovsk in this one place. Now all of it was engulfed in flames. What Mara calls the beating heart of Putin's entire logistics operation has bled out.
The weapons coming into Ukraine from the United States and Europe allow Ukraine to carry out serious, well-planned, and daring operations against superior enemy forces. And most importantly, Russian soldiers and junior officers are not emotionally involved in the war with Ukraine. For some, it's just a job. For others, it's about the money. Sometimes it's just like a game. You press a button, something flies, something explodes somewhere, just like on a computer screen. For Ukrainians, it's about defending their home, their loved ones, their families. It's the joy of victory. It's constantly coming up with new ways to strike the enemy more effectively. So the difference is, maybe it's a silly example, but it's like between hired staff and the owner. Because the owner, the one who possesses, will always be involved in everything. Better, faster, more thoroughly than a hired worker. Because he is passionate about what he does. This passion is the most important thing on the battlefield. There is nothing in the world more important for victory than this passion, enthusiasm, and emotional involvement of those who are fighting.
The facility burned for several hours after Ukraine's strike. Mara says that eyewitnesses couldn't find any other words except to call it a hellish landscape of fire that seemed endless. Just like with the strike on the headquarters of the 8th Combined Arms Army, Ukraine carefully selected the target, planned how to destroy it, and then struck with deadly precision. In an instant, Russia's entire summer strategy for Donetsk crumbled. No leadership, no weapons. All that Vladimir Putin has left are living people whom he keeps sending into attacks, knowing that they won't be able to do more than just absorb some of the Ukrainian ammunition, since no support will follow. As Sarak says, now that their ammunition supplies have turned to ashes, Moscow's infantrymen have been left to their fate without cover, underarmed, face-to-face with battle-hardened Ukrainian defenders. The occupation forces in Donetsk are now facing a grim reality. No shells, no rockets, no command.
You probably think I'm exaggerating when I say that the Kremlin is sending cannon fodder to the front. But gentlemen, they are recruits, incapable of fighting, and only serve as a way for Ukraine to expend ammunition. It's passionate even to say it. They are sent so that Ukraine uses more bullets, more shells, more mines, more of this, more of everything. This tactic can only work if the United States and Europe stop supplying Ukraine, and we already know that this tactic hasn't worked.
The man hobbles along carrying a rucksack and, apparently, a jug of water. At first glance, he might seem like an ordinary Russian soldier heading toward his inevitable death in Ukraine, but if you look closer, you can notice the wrinkles on his face and the heaviness in his steps. This is not an elite soldier. This is an elderly man whom the Russian President Vladimir Putin is sending to die for his invasion. This is the current state of the Russian army. Due to a shortage of soldiers, the country has begun deploying grandfathers to the front lines. And that means Putin doesn't mind using the most vulnerable people in Russian society to achieve his goals.
These are not just elderly ladies and gentlemen anymore. These are old people. Russia is calling up men. Only men, by the way, up to the age of 70
years old. In the bill that raised the draft age to 30, there was another law hidden. Russia has increased the age up to which reservists can be mobilized for military service, raising the maximum from the previous 65 to 70 years. The message was perfectly clear. For former servicemen, there is no way out of the Russian army. Retirement is no longer an option. Putin can call you up at any moment, and you'll have to go to war in Ukraine.
So there's an old man walking down the street, about 69 and a half years old. At that age, you can actually be young, or you can be an old man. He's limping, smacking his gums, and then suddenly, bam, he's sent to the front lines just like that, yeah. But I was on my way to see my grandchildren. Your country needs you. And now he's already dressed, maybe with a mess kit and a spoon if he's lucky, and a rifle. There you go. And now, so to speak, he's moving toward Kharkiv or Mariupol. Like the person served in the army and then retired. Let's say, yeah, and now go back to war. Or like a puck without a screw. Now, if we hit you, you'll know it from us. There. And ordinary soldiers without army training can fight, I think, up to 55 years old. But there's this tricky thing in the new law they just passed. That means you're fighting for the empire. Just a day before turning 55, you'll be discharged tomorrow. You survived, and everything is amazing. Suddenly, out of nowhere, they give you an officer's rank. They give you an officer's rank. You didn't ask for it, as they say, you didn't even earn it. So what are you supposed to do then? Whether you want to or not, now you have to serve another 5 years. But by rank, you're an officer, and in every other way, you're cannon fodder. And what if the war doesn't end? What are you supposed to do? You're already 60 and you're crawling out of your dugout again or wherever, and you say, "Thank God I survived." And then there's an envelope and they tell you, "We've made you a colonel." Who? A colonel? And you went back to the trench. Young people were fleeing en masse to Georgia, the Baltics, and Turkey. I think 1 million people fled. People of conscription age. Conscription has its own age, so to speak, from 18, I think, up to 40. 1 million potential recruits. That's why they started taking young recruits of a second youth.
Soldiers over the age of 45 made up about half of all new recruits in Russia, reports say. The publication. It also cites an anonymous source in the Moscow mayor's office, who said that the average age of recruits increased from 40 years at the beginning of 2024 to 50 years by October. And these recruits were far from the best of the best that the increasingly aging Russian population could provide. "They're all sick," reportedly said one Russian soldier fighting on the front line. "Their legs hurt, their heads hurt, and they're slow." The same publication, citing a study conducted by the Russian investigative group UMI Ryostka, reported that these elderly soldiers are dying in huge numbers. According to Ryostka, by October 2024, 2,475 Russian volunteers aged 45 and older had died. This accounts for about half of all confirmed Russian deaths at that point in the year. This figure is likely underestimated compared to the actual number. It even notes this, reporting in May 2025 that the likely number of Russian deaths in 2024 was 112.0. If that's the case, and the ratio of half remains. The Russian army lost 56 servicemen aged 45 in 2024.
That means the state won't have to pay them pensions, which I think makes the leadership of the country, called the Russian Federation, very happy. And we make the Ukrainians spend ammunition, plus we set up the pension recipients, and they get destroyed. As they say, we didn't touch them, the enemies did, the Ukrainians did. Good job, Ukrainians. All right, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic.
Putin is more than happy to replenish his army with old men so they can soak up bullets while he continues to hide the real problems his army is facing in the battles in Ukraine. But soon, Putin may run out of resources to make his contract offers to elderly Russian citizens. Ukraine is trying to achieve this through a series of strikes on the last thing keeping Russia's shadow fleet alive.
And as I have already told you, Europe and the United States are providing Ukraine with information about oil tankers secretly entering Russian ports. Quietly, they go in there. It's not recorded anywhere. They load up with oil or have it transferred to them from other tankers. And then they take it to their clients, who are thus violating international sanctions. And the Ukrainians, having received some information from some very kind people who may be on the other side of the ocean, I won't reveal to you who they are. They have learned how to blow up the steering and engine parts without spilling oil into the sea. Stopping this massive movement of oil could wipe out the Russian treasury and lead to a halt in payments to mercenaries, as well as payments for weapons supplies from abroad. And that's what we call cutting off their air supply. Russia is on the verge of another crisis, and without active help from China. Well, as you know, I've already talked about this. There are huge problems with Xi. If you haven't seen them, watch my previous two videos. Yes, well, maybe they'll rush to the negotiating table much faster than they think today. Stay tuned for future episodes. Hope to see you again soon. Because so many events are happening that even one episode a day isn't enough, we need to do 2 a day. Until we meet again.